Hello, my name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. We have come to the 6th book in my Project Poirot series, which is The Mystery of the Blue Train by Agatha Christie, featuring, of course, Hercule Poirot, and in a twist, it does not include a first-person narrator in the form of Hastings this time. It is an omniscient narrator, and I think that this is an interesting book in terms of sort of the development of Christie as a writer, but spoilers in terms of my opinion, I really don't like this book. This is the first book that we've come to that I can tell you, like, I don't like this one. I wouldn't recommend it, even though I know, other people might enjoy it. And actually, I was doing a little bit of reading, and Agatha Christie agrees with me. This was what she considered to be her worst book. And I think that some of that is because it was written at a very difficult point in her own life. This was right around the time her husband left her for another woman. And I think that this is just a book she associated with some painful memories, because objectively, I don't think this is actually her worst book, but it definitely isn't one of my favorites, and it's not necessarily one I would recommend, but there's still some interesting things happening in it, so let's get into that. As always, this will be spoiler free, and I will give you a little bit of a summary here, but to be honest, this one is really... It's tricky to summarize because there's just so many fucking characters, which is part of the problem that I have with this book. There's too many people in it, there's too much going on, and I just don't think she'd quite mastered having a cast of that size and doing something interesting with them, but we'll get into that. So in terms of the actual summary, we open the book and there is a shady kind of black market jewel sale happening. So this priceless set of rubies, allegedly worn by Catherine the Great, is being sold to an American billionaire named Rufus Van Alden, I believe is the name. And immediately after he buys these in Paris, somebody tries to steal them from him, but he, kind of thwarts them. But we pretty, just based on other scenes that we are seeing, come to realize that this is not going to be the last attempt to take these jewels. Meanwhile, Rufus goes and kind of talks to his daughter, who is Ruthie Kettering, I guess now is her last name. She's in a very unhappy marriage to a British lord, or will be a lord once his dad dies, named Derek Kettering. And it's basically, we come to realize it's a very loveless marriage. She married him for the title, he married her for her money. Neither of them is happy, and neither of them is being faithful to the other. So basically, Rufus Van Alden is convincing his daughter, like, look, just cut your losses and get a divorce, even though he is not fully aware of her sort of shenanigans in the marriage and doesn't totally understand why that is going to be a little bit of a tricky proposition. Anyway, he gives her these jewels because he's spoiled her to death. He loves her. She takes them. She insists that she's going to take them with her when she goes to the south of France. Now, to get to the south of France, she is going to take a train called the Blue Train, hence the title. And the Blue Train, just for context, is sort of... This would be almost the equivalent of if today we had something called the mystery of the private jet, or the mystery of the people who get to skip the TSA line at the airport. Basically what the Blue Train was a rich people's version of getting from the north of France to the south of France without having to do this whole rigmarole of going through Paris and having to do like custom stuff. You could pay extra and just get like an express to Nice, basically. So she's going to take that. There are other characters on this train, including her husband, come to find out, with his mistress. She's got her maid with her. Who else? She makes friends with this lady named Katherine Gray, who is a resident of Mary St. Mead, which will be where Miss Marple lives eventually, but she has just inherited a shit ton of money, so she's newly wealthy, and she's taking this train as well to the south of France to connect with some distant relatives who have only really become interested in her once she's inherited this money. And Ruthie Kettering kind of confides in her a little bit. Who else is on this? I think Poirot might be on the train. I don't remember. Oh god, everybody and their mom is on this train. Like I said, there are far too many characters in this book. And I guess I'm gonna have to tell you who gets killed, because that I feel like is, essential and not too big of a spoiler. But basically, spoilers a little bit, but Ruthie is the one who's murdered in this book. She is killed in her train car, and her rubies that she has just been given are stolen. So the entire book is about Poirot trying to figure out who who done that, and essentially I think Rufus Van Alden sort of loops him in to get him to do that. So, reasons I don't like this book. First of all, I don't like Rufus Van Alden, I don't like Ruthie. I find them both pretty insufferable, and since they're both such big pieces of this kind of puzzle, I'm just not that interested in them. I just don't like them. I don't find them interesting to read about, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for them, and which is a terrible thing to say because Ruthie dies and whatever, like, fine. But she's just not a very sympathetic victim, so I wasn't that invested in her being, like, having her death avenged. I also mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I just don't think Agatha Christie does a great job of managing her cast in this book. So there's a lot of people who in theory should be interesting. Like, there's a mysterious jewel thief whose real identity we don't find out until the very, very end of the book, but he's called the Marquis. And, like, that's interesting. So why, you know, that's in theory an interesting plot line, but I wasn't interested in it. There's a shady French count who Ruthie Kettering was having an affair with, called, I think, Comte de la Roche. That sounds right. He should be interesting. I wasn't interested in him. The person I like the best in this book is Katherine Gray, who inherited all that money, and she's to me the most interesting piece of this book. So I like her, but she's not enough a part of what's actually going on to really make her presence that justifiable to me. And I don't know, she's got these two, so Rufus Van Alden has a secretary named Knighton, and he's pursuing her, and then Derek Kettering is also interested in her, and it's just, I don't know, I just wasn't, I liked her, but I didn't feel like she belonged in the book. So there's so many characters involved, and what Poirot will do in later books, or what Christie rather will do in later books, is take a large cast and do interesting things with them so that, you know, their presence all feels justified. In this book, to me, it just feels sort of cluttered and crowded, and it keeps you from, I don't know, it doesn't connect enough. It's supposed to be a mystery, and I don't feel like the people involved connect to the mystery enough, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at here. If we're talking about kind of themes and my kind of overall interest in the moral development stuff that we've been talking about in this series, I think impersonation is an interesting theme here. So it happens on a number of levels, and I don't want to get, I mean, I mentioned the Marquis. He does have an alternate identity, which I don't think it's a surprise to say is a character that we've met. So it's interesting to kind of think through the Marquis, who is very ruthless, Poirot at the end of the book kind of talks about how he instinctively is a killer, even though what he does is steal jewels. He also is by nature a killer. So we kind of have this sort of double identity with him happening. Katherine Gray, it's not that she's an impersonator, but she's not comfortable in her new role, right? So she's always been a hired companion. That's how she inherited her money, was that the woman she was a companion to for a number of years really understands that Catherine's really the only person who actually gives a shit about her in her life, and that's why she leaves her all her money. But anyway, she's sort of new into this role of sort of a woman of leisure, and I think she feels sort of like an imposter, an impersonator quite a bit. There's references to a certain actress who is an impersonator. So anyway, I think there's a lot of things with sort of like double identities and how we all sort of wear different roles depending on who we're with. I definitely think you see that somewhat with Ruthie, because she's one way with her father and then very different with a lot of the people that we encounter in this book. So I think impersonation and sort of, again, the whole recurring thing of what you see isn't always the truth, which is really the underlying moral lesson of any mystery, but has been present throughout the series. I think another kind of maybe implicit critique that's being made here is this idea that privilege blinds. So, you know, I think Ruthie has a number of suppositions, and a number of her entitlement causes her to behave in such a way that sort of help facilitate her death. I'm not blaming her for getting murdered, but I think that she has made a number of choices that have set her up to be in this particular circumstance. Likewise, I think Rufus Van Alden, you know, he is very boastful about his ability to read people and know who is trustworthy and know how he wants to use them, basically. But by the end of the book, you come to realize that his confidence and his ability to do that may be somewhat misplaced. So I think there's this idea of privilege being a little bit of a blinder, particularly if it's like entitled privilege. And, you know, I think that another kind of what you see isn't always the truth element. There's one character who is very, very perceptive, but she's probably, aside from Katherine, the most desirable female in this book in terms of what actually matters, but she's not very attractive, so she has a hard time getting people to actually see who she really is. And then she also has sort of questionable preferences when it comes to men. So again, this sort of conflict between what, like, appearance and reality basically is the ongoing thing that I am driving at. I think the tension between appearance and reality is the overarching thing to get out of this book. And then two last sort of interesting notes. One is that Katherine Gray has a supernatural encounter after Ruthie Kettering is killed with Ruthie Kettering. So she has a sense of Ruthie telling her who the killer is and her acting on it. And it's interesting to me because Poirot sort of just takes this at face value and says, like, hey, strange shit happens sometimes, like, maybe this did happen. So again, I've mentioned before, but I think Agatha Christie is somewhat interested in the supernatural, and it allows Poirot ability to sort of hold that as a possibility. So he's very focused on my little gray cells, but he also allows room for some kind of supernatural elements, even though he is very focused on his own, like, logic and reasoning. And then just in terms of, like, a historical note, I think it is interesting that Ruthie and Rufus Van Alden are both Americans, and just sort of their portrayal as being sort of rich and careless in some ways, because the 20s in America, we associate that as a time of intense prosperity, overindulgence, very, like, fruitful, kind of like crazy partying that then just crashes in 29, and, you know, then we get into the Depression. But there's sort of this kind of feeling that the 20s are a decade of excess for Americans, whereas this is really the beginning of the end for the British aristocracy, the 20s. I mean, really, that's World War I, but the 20s are not a time of great prosperity in Britain. It's a time of kind of frugality and reeling still from the First World War and trying to sort of regroup. But by the time the Depression hits in the 30s, it takes Britain well into the 70s, 80s, whatever, to become kind of recovered from that. But the empire's on the wane, all of that. So it is interesting that the two characters sort of at the central of it's interesting seeing Americans in this context, right? Because Ruthie and Derek have gotten married because he wants her money, she wants his title. So the sort of ongoing story of America seeking respectability and sort of like being appreciated on a world stage, whereas Britain is now kind of looking for funds. They have the respectability and the power, but they don't necessarily have the economic power anymore. So if we're talking about ratings and like where I would put this, I gave this a 2-star on Goodreads on my reread, and I gave it a 3. That would be a 3 out of 7 unicorns for me. Of the books I've read so far, would put this as last. I like this the least out of the books that I've read in this project to date. So that will do it for this edition of Project Poirot. I feel like I was a little all over the place, but that probably is reflective of the fact that I didn't love this book that much. So do with that what you will. So let me know what you thought of this book if you have read it, and just let me know what you're thinking about this project in general. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined, and I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day, and I will talk to you later. Bye!